So, John, you're very interested in well-being and embodiment.
I am, Serge. I've spent a lot of time, I guess really most of my life now, I think, wrestling with that question. And I wouldn't have framed it that way in the past, but it's kind of becoming clear that that has been part of the issue. In much of my sort of earlier scholarship, I was looking at Western theories of well-being and flourishing and critiquing them from a kind of cross-cultural and historical perspective. And because they seem to me to be as much a sort of restatement of individualism as they were some sort of objective scientific truth. So I was in particular kind of looking at the way that many of these theories of well-being really neglected aspects of life that were central both to non-Western traditions, but also to earlier periods in Western history. Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, one thing would be current Western theories put a strong emphasis on like emotional satisfaction. But when you look cross-culturally, it's not that that's unimportant, but that gets trumped by so many other sort of virtues or ways of being a good person. So that, typically human beings have lived in some sort of worldview or understanding of the cosmos that gave their life meaning. Mm-hmm. And their role was to fulfill the position in life that was sort of that they were born into. And meaning came from doing that as well as possible. And that anyway, I think I'm kind of going off on a little bit of a tangent.
Let me maybe see if I'm catching you there. So,
sure.
In a way, when we talk about well-being, it's one of these things that seems so obvious. Everybody knows what we're talking about. And mm-hmm. You're pointing out that actually there is an implicit definition in a Western society of what well-being is. And that implicit definition is something that tends to be more individualistic. And there are other ways to conceive of it. And
that's right.
And so, that paying attention to that gives other dimensions that may not be as individualistic.
That's right, exactly. And so for a long time, I guess I have been trying to live out on a personal level a different understanding of well-being that's partly based on my commitment to my own spiritual practices, hatha yoga and meditation in particular. And but the idea of, or the task of formulating an alternative to some of these Western notions just seemed too daunting. And so I sort of been putting it off for years. And it feels like kind of the time is getting very close to articulate that. So one of the aspects for me, Serge, I think has come to do with sort of two pieces that I guess are kind of related. So one that I would think of as connected to, instead of a stance of kind of control and mastery over one's life with the goal of sort of maximizing positive experiences and minimizing negative feelings and negative experiences, that I think one of the contributions, well, that's not the right word, but one of the features that is so significant outside of our own kind of current time period is a notion that well-being has to do with spiritual surrender.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so interesting that I want to catch up a little bit, because first, you were saying about your practice, mm-hmm. Hatha yoga and meditation, and of wanting to, to make sense of it, but in a way, the experience and the practice are there. So, in a way, you have lived what you maybe have not been fully expressing in intellectual terms.
That's right.
And so in a way, what I'm noticing there is there's a primacy to the experience of it and the living it before formulating it, as opposed to living, how defining your well-being from an intellectual perspective and then using this to practice it. You have chosen to practice life as it obviously made some sense to you, and then to reflect on this practice.
That's right. That's right.
And then, the first point you're making is that what you're noticing is that this practice is one that's at odds with the Western thinking of, achieving mastery over things, in contrast to surrendering.
That's right, yes. And I think that shows up kind of in a number of ways. So, for instance, in Hatha Yoga, one is sort of, there are many different styles, but in the approach that I was taught, I think a more traditional approach that makes sense to me, one is learning how to hold a posture, an asana, with the least amount of effort possible. And so that, in a sense, you're putting yourself in a difficult or stressful or awkward situation, and then learning how to find ease in the midst of that. And that comes from learning how to let go and learning how to differentiate internally what parts of us, what muscles, to be more specific, are facilitating maintaining the position and which other parts aren't necessary. And learning how to release or let go of those things. So I think that was sort of an initial awareness of it. I think another way that...
So let me stop you here. So in a way, what I'm hearing there is that in the practice of going to a pose, which is something not ordinary, in a way a bit of a stress in some sense, instead of efforting through it, it's really, when doing something difficult, not trying to find a difficult way, but actually trying to ease into it, trying to find the way that works more naturally for the muscles to hold it with less effort.
That's right. And I was, after college, I spent a couple of years helping to start an ashram, a spiritual community in the Ozark Mountains that was based on a yogic lifestyle. And we were lucky to start working very closely with several Native American healers and began to do sweat lodge ceremonies on a regular basis. And the Native American sweat lodge taught me a lot about this because you're going into a completely dark container, like an igloo, but made of willow branches and originally hides, but now with tarps, and then bringing in very, very hot rocks into the sweat lodge. And it's done as a sacred ceremony, but then sealing the structure up and putting hot water on the rocks. And so it becomes extremely hot in there. And so hot that one tends to end up putting your face very close to the ground, because right on the bottom there's maybe a half of an inch of where it's a little cooler. And so again, it's a process of sort of humbling and really having to let go, because it can be so hot that I think our normal sense of what we can endure can't get us through that. And there's, I reached a point of just having to completely let go, because otherwise one would just go running out of it, and disrupting the whole ceremony. And yet there's something about transcending one's sense of what one can endure that is very powerful and brings about a deep sense of peacefulness and really harmony, I think, with what exists.
Mm-hmm. So what you're describing is that it's transcending what your limitations, what you normally could endure, but the going beyond is not doing it through straining and pushing, but actually finding a way or having to let go into it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I've been fortunate over the years. One of the things I like to do for fun is to seek out traditional healers and shamans sort of around the world and spend time with them. And not that I can even begin to comprehend all of what they're up to, but I find being in their presence to be just very meaningful and rewarding. And so I spend a lot of time with shamans in Bali, and their sort of whole orientation to life is based on spiritual surrender. And for them, our lives get out of balance when we are forgetting that there are sort of bigger realities that exist, and forget how to harmonize with things that are deeper and bigger and more powerful than sort of the individual and our own sort of egoic sense of purpose or desire. And so for the Balinese, this is, has a very metaphysical and spiritual dimension in terms of the gods and goddesses sort of operating through human beings, and that also with the idea that human beings exist on sort of multiple levels of reality at the same time, and learning how to kind of surrender to these other forces. Mm-hmm. And I think, whether or not that metaphysics makes sense, it left me with a deep appreciation for the importance, when life gets really challenging, of not trying to impose my will upon things, but learning, in a sense, again, how to surrender and to see what is life seeming to want from me at this moment, or what is needing to move through me.
Yeah. So I want to stay there a little bit, because when you say surrender, for many people, the word surrender is going to have a certain flavor.
Yes.
And on the other hand, what you just said right now is, in a way, what needs to go through me, or what does life demand of me, or what's my interaction with life. And so in the traditional understanding of surrender that we have, there is I, and there is something bigger than me that's crushing me. And
yes.
As I am crushed, I have to abjectly surrender. So very clearly a sense of, we're two, we're separate, I'm small, and surrendering is a defeat.
Yes.
And in the model that you're describing, in a way, what needs to go through me, or what does life demand of me, or what's my interaction with the universe, it's actually a dance, and it's really a collaboration, as opposed to being a surrender in a traditional sense.
Yes, that's a lovely way of putting it, Serge. And, I think that the way we've been talking about it, it makes it also sound like we're dealing with kind of external versus me versus something external. Mm-hmm. And actually, I think where it has shown up the strongest for me is more dealing with my internal experience. So, for instance, learning my wife and I separated probably 14 years ago, or my ex-wife now. And when that first happened, part of all of this experience with both my own sort of yoga and meditation practice, but also with Native American and Balinese healers, made me realize that what I needed to do was to really sit with what was happening internally. So the sense of grief and terror and fear was just simply overwhelming. And so I knew enough from these other practices to know that trying to avoid that or trying to sort of control it, and make it sort of go away was not the solution. But that it was actually learning to sit with and really fully go into all of the anxiety, all of the terror, all of the dread. And so during this period, I would meditate a couple of times a day at least, and really try to embrace and go into the depths and heart of the intensity internally.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And of course, just hearing it described that way, it sounds like, oh, I just meditate on this. But at those moments where, most of us actually are so bent on avoiding it, just not even aware. I mean, we have all these mechanisms to escape that.
Right.
To not stay with it, to not be able to bear it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And in that moment, I felt like my life was really in jeopardy. That these internal feelings were so powerful, and that initially I was actually feeling quite suicidal,
Mm-hmm.
and but over time, learning how to bear and to tolerate those feelings and to allow them to move through us in sort of their own way and in their own timing, I think, to me, that's really what I mean by surrender and
Mm-hmm,
letting
mm-hmm.
things be.
But so, we have, in a way, John of now. And if John of now could speak to John of 14 years ago, going through that struggle, what would John of now be able to tell the John of then, to ease a little bit that moment, to invite him, to make it more possible for him to go into this process?
Mm. Well, that's a great question, Serge. I think, though, the John of 14 years ago was actually doing a pretty good job of it. It was probably the John of junior high school and high school that could have used some of that advice. Because that was a really rather dark time where I was going through a kind of an existential crisis.
Mm-hmm.
But too terrified to really fully feel it. I just didn't have the resources at the time.
And so what about that? What would the John of now say to the John of high school?
I think at that point, Serge, I was too terrified of what was happening in my body. I had a existential crisis in like 6th and 7th grade where I really struggled to find meaning in life. And this was I was born in 62, so this was around 72, where as I was coming to awareness of the larger social world, there were a lot of really very difficult things happening at the time with Vietnam and then Watergate and the growing awareness of the environmental degradation that was occurring. And so those things sort of profoundly shook me, and I didn't have much sense of optimism that the human condition was getting better or that the adults in the world really knew how to kind of address these issues. And but I think I responded in a sort of more intellectual, cognitive way of searching for meaning and trying to figure that out with my mind. which wasn't all bad. And I think it's sort of, I'm still doing that to some degree. But I think that the despair that I was experiencing was in my body, and I didn't have the tools to really host that despair and to integrate it. And so really it was only later that I've learned how, when things get really intense, to stay with what's happening in my body and experience it there, as opposed to sort of letting the energy of these strong and dark and powerful emotions just fuel a sort of racing mind that doesn't stop and doesn't rest.
Yeah, and I certainly can identify with this. So that sense of, we tend to identify with our mind, our intellect, our ability to make sense of things. And there's, in a way, the more dire the situation, the more the sense of urgency about comprehending the situation, understanding it, making sense of it, with the idea that the making sense of it is going to give us the tool to actually change it or control it.
Exactly.
And so what you're talking about is the shift from identifying with our logic, with our rational mind, with a capacity to understand things, and to see ourselves as a mind-body whole organism through which stuff is flowing.
That's right.
And yeah.
Yeah, and in some of the more recent theoretical work by people like Damasio or Mark Bickert or Alan Shore that are talking about the way that the origins of the self are really in the body, in somatic and affective experience. And Freud made a similar point, as did Winnicott. So I think that, to me, has become really critical in terms of moving away from an over-identification with the sort of Cartesian eye, this thinking, supposedly rational part of us, and valuing that part of us, of course, but realizing that there's a deeper part of us that's more in the body. And this, of course, links up nicely with Jenlin's work on felt sense.
But as I'm reflecting on what you were sharing about your struggle as a 10-year-old, it feels like a similar situation to what you were describing with the Sweat Lodge, of the trying so hard to solve things with the tool you have. Again, I certainly can identify with that, to the point where it's so impossible that, in a way, there's a breakdown of it, just the same way as resolving a koan. You try so hard to resolve it in a logical way until you can't.
Right.
And then you have access to another mode of understanding.
Yes. Yes.
And it feels like, these episodes have, kind of that quality of going through the experience in order to let go of one way of confronting and handling experience, because you hit the limitation and then you get to something else.
Yes, exactly. It was a funny story when I first met one of the Balinese shamans that I've known now for about 20 years and worked with. He looked at me, and then he really looks at you, where it's sort of he looks into your eyes and sees everything, like deeply into your soul. And there's a vague sense of, oh, maybe I should put up a little wall or barrier, and then the realization that that's not going to help. This guy can just, see brick walls. So he looks at me, and then he starts laughing, and he points at my head, and he spins his his finger around in a circle, and to indicate that my head is just spinning. And he was right. And at that point, I had already been, practicing body-centered, practices for 10 years. And yet I was still very much in my head. And I spent the better part of a summer walking around in rice paddies barefoot, to try to learn how to get back into my body and feel grounded.
Yeah, yeah. And so yeah, that's it's not part of our basic experience of the world, our basic learning. We have to work at it.
Yes, at least not in the contemporary West, and I think increasingly probably around the world as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the sort of kind of dual things about letting go, letting be, spiritual surrender on the one hand, and working kind of with the primacy of the body, have been sort of very important and, in my sense of missing elements of well-being. I don't want to say that there's not a place for more Western approaches, because in some ways those originated historically for good reasons, to cope with, I think, orientations to life that maybe overemphasize spiritual surrender and sort of compliance, often with social systems that weren't just, or contained abuses, or were overly patriarchal. So there's important reasons that the American Revolution and the French Revolution occurred, and in some ways, Western notions of well-being really draw on that spirit of emancipating the individual from what society expects and letting the person come to their own sense of what their life should be about, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But at the same time, I think we've thrown out something really important, which many of these traditional societies have emphasized, which is learning to let go and adapt to sometimes existing realities.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm glad that you put it in these terms, because in a way, if we put it in say the political terms of, why was the revolution justified? Because we're talking about oppression. And so if we put on the one hand oppression, and then oppression goes together with surrender, because that's what oppression wants you to do. It wants to surrender to that power.
Right.
And then obviously it makes a lot of sense to be individualistic, to rebel, to refuse surrender. But it's actually, it's not surrender in general. It's surrender to what? And so what you're pointing out in your examples is the quality of surrender is not to surrender to a master, but surrender to a vision of the universe in which you have a role that is actually enhanced by participating in the universe, by letting go of the things that prevent you from participating as fully as you can.
Exactly.
And so, in a way, the criticism of, rational logic is not that it's bad, but if you only are limited to it, you're not playing with a full deck. And so the idea of surrender to, just opening up and seeing more than the small part.
Right. And then, so, we've sort of been talking about this in more kind of phenomenological terms. But I think then we can flip our theoretical lens and use more of a scientific, physiological frame to look at some of these same things as well. So that, in a sense, if we think about a stance of control and mastery versus one of sort of openness to experience and letting go or letting be or surrendering to it, it links up interestingly with sort of the physiology of stress. So that, in other words, when we go to a place of letting go, letting be, or openness to experience, it is a stance of that I think is linked to a more balanced sympathetic or autonomic nervous system state, or more of a parasympathetic dominant nervous system state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas control and mastery seem to me to be more linked to a sympathetic nervous system state, or flight-fight response.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a kind of, it sort of draws on a kind of sense of identity of me versus the world, or my in-group versus some out-group.
So I want to stay a little more on that part.
Sure.
So certainly, I'm not sure I'm in the same boat fully as where you are. When you're talking about, the control, the mastery, being more in sympathetic activation, I see just there's a lot of energy going there. And the energy is used into, holding a tight grip.
Right.
So that, in a way, that energy is not flowing. And
That's
the
right.
optimal use of sympathetic energy, of fight and flight system, is actually that it's used to flow so that you can have perfect, strength for attack or for running away. But that the holding is actually something where the energy keeps circulating inside, and you have kind of an implosion inside, as opposed to putting that energy to circulate, that energy into action in the world. So is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, similarly. So we tend to think about sort of the stress response, being in a sympathetic nervous system state, flight-fight, as largely about threats in the external world. But it can also be about threats in our internal environment. So if we live our lives sort of out of our head with the goal of maximizing positive experiences and avoiding negative experiences, and whether we do that sort of explicitly as a philosophy of life, or whether we've just sort of picked that up culturally, like most of us have, and operate out of that implicitly, there's a way in which we can be vigilant towards what's actually happening in our internal world, what's actually happening kind of from the neck down. And so then we try to compensate with adding in more strategies of control over what's going on, or distraction, denial, acting out. But that ends up perpetuating, again, the sort of activation of the sympathetic nervous system state.
Yeah, and even actually your choice of word, when you start to say we are vigilant about what's happening, and so the vigilance is already part of that activation.
That's right.
Because it's not a flowing quality. It's not a gentle observing. There
That's
is
right.
there is that tightness about it.
Exactly, and the tightness is the critical thing, And so when that's happening, we're spending more of our life, ideally, in a vigilant, contracted state than we should. And one of the things that we've sort of learning from this physiology of stress, and like Robert Sapolsky's work in particular, is that the more time we spend in a sympathetic nervous system state, described sort of physiologically, or the more time we spend in a vigilant state, described more phenomenologically, the worse our health is. So that, the sympathetic nervous system, as he describes it, it's designed to be turned on for those really dire emergencies and then turned off. Mm-hmm. But we leave it on far too much of the time, and this is linked to the sort of epidemic proportions of the illnesses of modernity.
Right.
Right. So
it's living in crisis, basically the permanent crisis.
Exactly.
Instead of the permanent revolution in, China, there was a permanent crisis that we have at a gut level day in and day out.
Right. So if we think instead about, like going back to what I talked about initially with a yoga pose, if we can learn sort of how to find a place of ease in the midst of difficulty so that we're not adding more tension, more contraction onto what's already a challenging position.
So let me just take that as a, in a way, use it as a metaphor. What you describe as in the yoga pose as a metaphor that's applicable to life. That in a way we're going to tend to go through life with a lot of crisis because we're Westerners and we tend to perceive life in these terms. And so as we're in the midst of any of these things, maybe that little observing part that's noticing, oh, in a way, I'm in a pose. I'm one of these moments where my dance with the universe, my dance with the world, my dance with what I perceive is going to experience myself as being in crisis. And when I'm experiencing myself this way, I tend to tense up. And so to noticing and pay attention to the energy at an embodied level, not just as so in a way, just the same way as in yoga, you pay attention to your muscles, to your, here, that sense of, okay, what's happening inside, and with a gentle awareness that it would be nice to actually let that energy flow a little bit and release it, as opposed to being so tense. In that crisis mode of vigilance and holding tight and striving, so that we kind of flow through the energy instead of trying to control it.
Yes. That's really nicely put, Serge. But sometimes that actually means going into the heart of these very difficult emotions that we've been trying to avoid. But they're ultimately survivable. Extreme anger, extreme rage, extreme despair, extreme grief. And they're actually easier to bear when we fully experience what these things are like, when we go deeply into them. They seem to move through us more quickly. And in that stance, then, basically kind of what we're doing, whether it's a yoga pose that's challenging, or whether it's a difficult life experience that brings some of these so-called dark emotions with them, is that we're bringing the parasympathetic nervous system online in the midst of a situation that would normally lead to even more sympathetic nervous system activation.
As you describe it this way, I'd like to paraphrase it a little bit. When you say the sympathetic activation and the parasympathetic system online, I imagine in a way that we go through something that's difficult, and not only is there the difficulty, the pain, the difficulty making room in the body for the experience, the physical experience of the emotion, but there's also the fear of going into something that is difficult. And so hence the parasympathetic is the fear of fear itself, or the fear of the sensation, the fear of the experience.
Well, actually, that's still more sympathetic.
The sympathetic part, I meant the sympathetic.
Right.
And the parasympathetic would be like the gentle mentor, the parent, the mentor, the friend say, hey, you know what? This is okay.
Yes.
And so the parasympathetic is there to calm down that fear and say, this is it's part of the human condition. That kind of pain, it seems so intense, but you're going to be okay.
Yes. Yeah, and that's such a lovely point, that ideally we learn about these things from our parents or family members or, a caring community that sort of holds us while we're experiencing, the pain of a skinned knee or the pain of heartbreak or the frustration of this or that. But so many of us don't get that anymore.
Yeah, so we're talking about, in a way, that emotional literacy.
That's right. And Winnicott, back in the 40s noticed this and said that, when we don't have the right holding environment, we precociously sort of abandon our body and go up into our head to try to cope with life. And so that we precociously, he saw this happening as early as infancy, precociously kind of overly develop more cognitive faculties, and we abandoned our somatic and affective core of who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And that this leads to what he called the false self.
Yeah. And so that's where we're coming back to where we started with that sense of well-being as embodied experience.
Right. And that the precursor for that is the sense of safety and security. So this becomes to me really interesting because it links together all sorts of things that we tend to kind of treat separately. So obviously attachment theory and Winnicott's work in object relations theory have also focused on the importance of safety and security. But we can start to now link that to sort of the physiology of stress and realizing that when we don't have safety and security, we spend too much of our life in a vigilant state. And the vigilance is sometimes directed externally and sometimes internally. But that the more time we spend in a vigilant state, the more time our sympathetic nervous system is overactivated, and that compromises our physical health. And I think this makes sense of some of the recent work on social disparities in health, where we're finding, like with the Whitehall study and studies since, that if you're not at the top of the socioeconomic hierarchy, your health is compromised at pretty much all levels, including your mortality rates. And the further down the hierarchy you are, the worse your health is going to be. And interestingly, the at least initial ways that was made sense of was that people at the top had a greater sense of being in control. But I think that that's actually kind of a very Western way of interpreting those results. And that if you sort of flip it upside down, what it might mean is that being in control might make sense in an individualistic society as a way of feeling safe and secure. But there are actually many ways of feeling safe and secure, including being part of an extended family, which, is becoming something rare in Western modern societies, or living in a universe that seems meaningful, a cosmic structure that holds us, having religious faith, or even being in a society that provides a social safety net, so that if one becomes unemployed or has a sick child, one doesn't have to worry that one's life is going to fall apart.
And I want to tweak a little bit what you're saying, kind of probably saying something very similar, but in a slightly different way. You're pointing out that the traditional interpretation of this kind of study is that people on the upper end of the scale have more control. And you say, no, it's more about safety. But I think the tweaking, the interesting part is that people, in a way, the cultural bias is that safety is something that in a way is not controllable, and so the only variable to have is control. And so we focus on that.
Yes.
Actually, it's in a way, by focusing on that, we distort what it is that we need to pay attention to. Because what the organism responds to is the sense of feeling safe or not safe. And so that, of course, to some extent, focusing on control is going to be effective to increase in some conditions the sense of safety. But it's actually confusing the two leads to trouble. Yes. And so the point is really actually to say that while that there is a value to control, the ultimate point is the experience of safety.
Yeah, and then that becomes kind of an interesting metric or index for starting to kind of reevaluate how we live as a society. Because if safety and security are central to well-being, which isn't a new point, I mean, it was, Maslow made that point as well as attachment theorists and stuff, but if it is at the core of what could be called autonomic regulation, the ability for our nervous system to spend the least amount of time in a strong sympathetic nervous system state, then we need to maybe look at, and if in fact our mortality, our lifespan is dependent on the degree to which we feel safe and secure in the world versus the amount of time we spend in a vigilant state, then it makes sense to start to look at our society and through the lens of safety and security. How much do we provide this for people?
Yeah.
And we can, so at one level we can, talk about it in terms of families and parenting and trying to help parents provide more of a secure base for their children. And that's important. But parents can only provide what they themselves have and experience. And it seems like that when you look critically, particularly at American society maybe versus some of the Eastern or European societies, we've, not provided social safety nets for people. And we have, far too many neighborhoods that are dangerous, where once you step out of your apartment, in too many inner cities, you have to be vigilant. You have to be looking over your shoulders all the time. And there aren't places where one can experience this sort of letting go or letting be or openness or surrender. And yet that becomes something that we all need and is critical. So it becomes kind of an interesting way of critiquing our society and exploring, how might we develop social policies that really try to take seriously the idea that we all need to feel safe and secure more than we do. And in fact, the high cost of our healthcare system, one could argue, is largely linked to the fact that too many of us spend too much time being vigilant.
Yeah. So the interesting part is that we're no longer just talking about safety in the extreme situation of life or death.
That's right.
But talking about the moment-by-moment experience of safety.
That's right.
And, to the extent that it's so prevalent, that sense of vigilance and that sense of not being safe, that we don't even notice it on a moment-by-moment basis. Right. And that moment-by-moment experience of lack of safety is, of course, what creates stress, even among those of us who are relatively privileged, and, of course, is even worse among people who live in a more disfavored kind of environment. So then it becomes a question of not just looking at the cost of major illness or but essentially to say that, society is not functioning optimally because an enormous amount of the resources are wasted through dealing with the stress of, that sense of lack of safety.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And, our health, the health of our nation is ranked something like 37th in the world, which is really rather appalling given what we spend on things. But, until we address the root causes of perhaps some of the health conditions that we face, which is that, again, we're spending too much time in a sympathetic nervous system state, or in other words, we're spending too much time being vigilant and don't feel safe and secure and sort of held by life, by society. We're going to continue to be ranked poorly.
And interestingly enough, that there's a whole paradigm there, because you and I have our understanding of what feeling safe means. But to a lot of people, um, the idea of safety feels like cuddling people, or
Yes.
the idea of performance is equated with the idea of difficulty, with effort, with that concept of survival of the fittest. And so and of course there is a value to it, like for instance the training of the Navy SEALs, where you take the people who are the most able to overcome the most rigorous type of situation. There is a certain value, if you want, in certain functions in order to find the toughest people to go that way. But for society to function optimally, there is also safety, and safety not being equated with mollycoddling, and so maybe there is a sense of communicating a different sense of what safety means.
Yes, and that's a really nice point, and I think that's an ongoing work to flesh that out. But so in some ways, it gets back to sort of this idea of really being able to bear our experience and to be aware of it and accept it. So this is, of course, what mindfulness is about.
Mm-hmm.
But to do that requires, again, a sense of safety.
Yeah, but so it's interesting because just as you start describing it this way, there is a dimension of safety that, in a way, gets more similar to what it's like to practice an extreme sport. So less frightening to people who fear safety as cuddling people. You're saying, in order to be better able to bear the unbearable, safety is going to help you do that. So
Yes.
We're talking about almost like practicing the extreme sport and going into high performance. And under these conditions, you can perform better. So
yes, yeah. I'm glad you made that connection, because there is a way that, when life becomes really difficult, whether we're dealing with chronic pain or an emotional experience that is incredibly challenging, it does require that sort of courage of a top athlete or a SEAL to be able to really go into that experience without disconnecting from it. There's a kind of courage and willing, in being willing to really fully enter into what life brings to us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so courage and, in a way, encouragement. So what we do as a group, as a society, is help each other with encouragement in order to go to these difficult places.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the exact opposite of enabling people to avoid difficulties, enabling people to shrink from life.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Mm.
So maybe that feels like a nice place to stop this conversation.
Sure. Yeah.
This recording is part of the podcast at relationalimplicit.com. Courage and, in a way, encouragement. So what we do as a group, as a society, is help each other with encouragement in order to go to these difficult places.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the exact opposite of enabling people to avoid difficulties, enabling people to shrink from life.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Mm.
So maybe that feels like a nice place to stop this conversation.
Sure. Yeah.
This recording is part of the Somatic Mindfulness and Relational Psychotherapy podcast. See the website relationalimplicit.com.